Well, look at this. There's a whole bunch of you here tonight. I guess we all had the same idea. Thinking we'd come together for a good old time at the campfire, share some stories, have a few laughs. Definitely find something to put in your mug. Lots of options there. Now I saw some popcorn making the rounds, and someone brought the makings for having s'mores. Oh boy, this is looking like a good one. Since there's so many of us here, tonight would be a good night to talk about our favorite forest ranger, Liz, and her large friend. Now, some of you here may not know much about her and her story. I think it'd be a good time to retell her adventures, bring you up to date on her latest escapades over the Halloween holiday. So fill your mug, find a good spot near the fire, and let's go back to the beginning with Ranger Liz. I have an interesting story I'd like to share tonight. Well, it's about the contact between the critters that call the woods home and the people that work daily in that environment. Most times the interactions, they're without great consequence. They're just trying to keep a chipmunk out of your food supply, to having to brake your car to avoid hitting a deer in the road, birds that you see, that kind of thing. Well, once you've been out here for a while, it just sort of flows together, and it's all pretty much insignificant. It all sort of makes sense. It's nature. But sometimes things happen that just don't have an obvious explanation, right? So such it was for Ranger Elizabeth, Liz they called her, Garrett. She'd been with the Forest Service for 8 years now. 3 years of seasonal work. Now seasonal workers, they get all the tough work, like bagging trash up and clearing brush out of campsites and trail work and weeding and cleaning and stocking the toilets for the summer tourists that come up to enjoy their national forests. So then 5 years back, she was lucky enough to get a full-time position, her dream job. She didn't have to do the grunge work that a seasonal hire had to do anymore, and she got to be in the woods year-round. Though most of it was in a guard shack now, and it was, tourist interaction. But there's so much more to see than just what happens in the summer. The fall, it brings the hunters and the best colors in the trees. Now the winter, it brings the hardy folks that they come up to play in the snow and won't get their cars stuck, of course. And in the spring is the explosion of bugs and plants and animals that they're all trying to interact and follow that driving force within all of us to reproduce and further our species. Now the males, they strut and spar and they try anything to win the favor of the females, right? So it's such a crazy time in the wild that things don't always go as planned. There's a lot of emotions and a lot of hormones, right? So when Liz left her guard shack and locked up to go home for the night, she definitely misunderstood the meaning of the rabbit carcass on the hood of her car. Only about 100 foot away from her little office guard shack thing, the employee parking lot sat off the road behind a curtain of young trees. Though she could see where her Subaru was parked if she stepped out of the shack and looked back toward where the creek was, she didn't normally do that. And nobody ever had problems with theft or vandalism in that lot because it was off the road and really only a few staff members parked there. So she thought one of her colleagues did that as a prank. Not a funny prank, mind her, in her opinion, but then the seasonal workers were just starting to show up, and she figured it was just one of the gang working off some pent-up energy after a long winter. She lifted the rabbit off her car and carried it down towards the creek. She laid its body there on a rock. She was sure that sometime before she got back to work in the morning, one of the many different scavengers would have made good use of this free protein. So she got in her Subaru and started home to her apartment. She didn't give it another thought, and nobody came forward to admit they'd done it. So it was just that a week later, she'd already put it out of her mind. She had a good day and was ready to go home. So she closed down, she locked the door, and started out to the parking lot where her car was. Well, as she got close to her car, she saw something on the windshield. Her mind went right away to that rabbit from last week, but as she stepped up to the driver's side of a car, she saw a large bunch of wildflowers on the hood and up on the windshield there. Someone had plucked a huge bunch of Virginia bluebells and placed them on Liz's car. Though beautiful, it was nonetheless disturbing, taken with the events of last week with the rabbit. Now this became a problem. Someone was scaring Liz. She looked around, all the way around. She shivered. She wondered to herself, did she have a stalker? Who was it? Was he watching her right now? She grabbed the flowers and threw them off to the side of her car. All of a sudden scared, she opened her door and she got in and she locked her doors. She was overcome with emotion. She started to lose it. A few tears started down her cheeks. And when she got a hold of herself, firmly telling herself out loud, "You're strong, way stronger than this." With newfound determination, she started that car up and backed out of her parking spot and drove for home. Always a thinker, she did her best thinking while driving. Oh, a lot of us do. I do. Flowers and a dead rabbit. Those two things don't go together, no matter what. Well, they didn't naturally put themselves on my car, so someone did. So I'll set a trap, and I'll catch them. Now, Liz was an amateur photographer, and a good one. A few of her images had made it to the local paper, and one was in a national parks pamphlet. And she, if anyone, understood the power of a photograph. She had a trail camera, and I think y'all know what that is. You know, you tie it onto a tree, and it's got batteries in it and a camera built into this body, and when something gets close enough to trip the beam, it takes a photo of it, or video, and heck, they got nice ones now that take infrared photos, all kinds of stuff. So she had one of those, and she was going to set it up inside her car, and she would catch the person that was messing with her. If she wanted to, she could turn them into HR, and they might lose their job. At the very least, she could make them stop leaving things on her Subaru. Well, now she had a plan. She celebrated with her favorite vegan dinner and slept like a baby that night. The next day, she parked in her normal spot, set up the camera so that it was hidden in the back seat and the prankster wouldn't see it. She went into her booth, didn't look back at the car all day long. She was a little disappointed that night when she only had pictures of a chipmunk jumping on the hood 11 times and a few birds that tripped the sensors on the trail cam. In fact, that's the way it was all the rest of the week. But Friday, hoo boy, what a surprise. She walked out to her car at the end of the day, not expecting to find anything there. But once she sat down in the driver's seat, she looked up through the windshield and she could see that someone had smeared something all over the glass. "What the hell? That's nasty," she said. She got out and cleaned the mess off the windshield with paper towels and Windex she kept in the back of her car. Not knowing what it was that she cleaned off, she threw the towels away in the trash can at the head of the lot, got in and drove home, thinking to herself that she would turn this creep in and hope he lost his job. Who knows what he had smeared all over her window. Well, she got home and pulled the chip out of the camera, inserted it into her computer, and got the shock of her life. There were 119 separate still pictures of a large, hairy face that only a mom could love, kissing and licking and generally making out with the windshield of her Subaru. A few pictures showed the creature was smelling the door frame with eyes closed. Now, I don't think Liz really got what happened here. You see, the first 3 years she worked in the park, she spent all of her time outdoors, and it was sometime during the 3rd year when the Bigfoot, and that's what he is, crossed paths with the park ranger. You see, Liz is one of those natural women, sort of a modern hippie, Humboldt honey they call him in Northern Cal. She didn't shave at all, she wore no modern chemical deodorants or perfumes, and she washed her clothes with clean natural soaps. Basically a healthy woman. Now this is what caught the eye of this young male Sasquatch. She smelled good, she looked good, and she never was with a mate. She was available, right? So it was that he set out to impress her. The rabbit was a gift to prove his hunting prowess, the bluebells for the beauty, and finally overcome with lust, he couldn't hold back, and he gave a display of affection, loving on her car, spurred on by her scent inside the car. She told her boss, who then moved to put lighting in the parking lot and approved Liz to move to a different location at the other end of the park. Now the beast, with a broken heart, he moved on. He's probably still roaming the forest, always in search of his lost love. Every once in a while, the whiff of patchouli will get him excited, and with some high hopes he will track the smell, only to be disappointed again. So you see, folks, another one of life's lessons. Even if we think we may have found that one, love is a two-way street. I've got an update story to tell you. Well, after her game camera showed that a young male Squatch had left gifts on her car and was apparently enamored with her, she requested and was given a reassignment to the other end of the park. She didn't show her bosses any of the 119 pictures she had of the hairy face kissing her Subaru because she didn't want trouble. She was a nature lover and there wasn't any real damage, so she figured that a new start in a new area of the park 20 miles downstream would be the best move. And it worked for her. It had been about 6 months since she started as a supervisor of sorts. She had a Park Service pickup, and she was to drive to all the remote facilities in this region and write inspection reports. Sort of look for trails that needed repair or broken picnic tables, watch for any conflicts that tourists might occur. She was good in this position, and she really took her job seriously. She often found herself parking the truck and walking 2 or 3 miles just to inspect a remote tourist feature somewhere. And so it was that she found herself a mile up the trail from the trailhead and almost to the river overlook, where the trail came out of the trees and brush to look over a beautiful river canyon. Almost 100 yards down a brushy hillside was the river, and it was a foamy, boiling river with deep, dark pools and occasional waterfalls. So Liz stood out at the overlook and took in the sweeping views. It's beautiful. Made it all worthwhile. But she wasn't the only one there that day. Nope. 3 lives were about to cross paths, and it would be life-changing for all 3. 6 months back, after the Sasquatch couldn't find the Subaru, where it had been parked every day for years, and he didn't smell the patchouli oil that was the aura that surrounded the most intriguing creature he had ever seen, he became a little despondent and sort of wandered aimlessly, just hiding and surviving. So it was that he found himself at a low bank section of the river below a pretty good sized waterfall at the edge of a large dark pool and the head of a long set of rapids. Though he was always on alert, Bigfoot have to be, you know. Because of the sounds from the moving water, he just wasn't aware that he was being stalked. A large, dangerous, 35-year-old dominant male Squatch with burning red eyes was slowly creeping up on him from directly behind, with murder on his mind. Just 20 feet away, and the squatting young male half turned in just in time to see the large form rushing him with a pine limb held as a club, and instinctively turning away and taking the club on the shoulder kind of as a glancing blow, saved the young male's life. The force of the murderous rush from the large male carried them both into the river. When he hit the water, he instinctively dove down into the dark pool. If it weren't such a dark, moonless night, he may have been found and murdered by the dominant male. The Sasquatch was trying to kill his competition for any breeding females. Well, this is the way of nature, and it has been for all of time. Probably always will be. Well, the young Bigfoot worked his way downriver, staying as close to the bottom as he could. He knew the danger if he was found, especially with a wounded shoulder from that club. Well, holding his breath, he made it through the rapids and surfaced under an overhanging bank covered by willows. Out of sight, he recovered his breath and he tried to locate his attacker using his sharp senses. Well, he stayed in his hideout for a good half hour, not wanting to be found there in the daylight. He knew he would have to take the risk of getting caught, and move away from where he was. He figured the most concealment could be found in the river, and going upriver was impossible because of the rapids and the waterfall, so downriver was the best chance of survival. So, taking a big breath, he submerged and kicked away from the bank. He surfaced near rocks and logs and would get another breath and resubmerge and move on down the river in that way. He traveled this way for about an hour and a half until he got to the top of a waterfall, and he was forced to get out of the river and portage the falls. He rested there on the bank and he fell into a deep sleep. He woke at dawn and got up and moved into some thick brush to sleep most of the day away. His injury hurt, and sleeping seemed to be the best thing he could do. So he packed some mud on the shoulder, and that usually helps, and went and laid down. Well, moving at night and resting often, he continued downriver for several days. Then, leaving the river canyon, he climbed to a rocky knob to rest there. There weren't any tourists up there. He went in to rest for the day. Now that gets two of them in the same location, and now for the third. Odin Doddle, what a waste of a life. He cared for nothing, he loved nothing, and he did nothing constructive. In fact, the opposite applied. He hated everything and he destroyed everything that crossed his path. He was a murderer, a rapist, and represented everything that was evil on this planet. He had been released early from his latest stint in federal prison. Apparently, he displayed good behavior while incarcerated. Shuffled to a halfway house where he stayed several weeks until he could cut his ankle monitor off and leave town in a hurry. It was 6 hours before he was missed, but by that time he was long gone, 300 miles away. Catching a ride at the truck stop, he rode till the trucker stopped for the day. He began walking then. It wasn't unusual to see walkers and hikers this close to the mountains. He attracted very little attention as he climbed the winding country road. Staying in the shadows when he heard a car approaching, he was able to get to the trailhead for the canyon outlook in just 4 days total. And that is how we now have the 3 participants in this fateful event about to cross paths. Waking up in the late afternoon, fully rested from sleeping all day on that rocky knob, he began to stretch his shoulders and was much better and had healed nicely since his attack 4 days back. He watched the small birds flitting about, and then there it was. A familiar smell. From the back of his mind came all the emotions associated with it. There was hope, and there was happiness, and there was loss and despair. Curious, he moved to the edge of the rocky knob, and there below him, on the trail, was Liz. She had left her truck in the lot and walked a mile up to the overlook when the Bigfoot smelled her familiar scent. Natural soaps and patchouli oil are very distinctive in the wild. At the same time that he saw Liz, he saw another human behind her and closing fast. From his vantage point above and slightly behind, he had a good view of the 2 hikers. This wasn't new for Ogun. Though skinny, he was wiry strong, and he could easily overpower the ranger. The element of surprise was important in the taking of his victims. What would he do to this one? He didn't know. He sort of became a different person when this happened. One thing for sure is his victims always suffered. They always felt his hatred for life, and they always died, begging to live. His pace quickened as he closed the gap on the ranger. He reached out and he grabbed her around the waist from behind, pinning her arms at her side in the embrace. Liz was taken by surprise, so taken by the panorama before her that she didn't hear the maniac's last rush. She struggled, but she was at a huge disadvantage. She was following the same path as Odin Doddle's victims. Time was critical now. In a few minutes, she'd be lost. But what she had that the others didn't was a very mad, very large, and hugely physical Bigfoot to intervene. Sensing trouble in the way the man had approached the ranger, and now with Liz struggling, the young Squatch became the beast that he always was. He jumped down the hill to the trail in 2 giant leaps. Then, moving with the speed that only a crazy, mad giant has, he hit that maniac and, prying him from his victim, continued off the trail and down the brushy slope towards a river, moving at a run while holding the criminal around the waist and dragging him through the brush, making ungodly, scary sounds as they went. It had all happened so fast for Liz that she wasn't really sure what had happened. First, a person grabbed her from behind for no reason, then held her and wouldn't let her go. Well, what she remembered most about him was his strong grip and his terrible breath. It smelled like death. And she wasn't wrong, but it wasn't her death this time. Odin hit the water backwards. Still in the grasp of the giant, he got to look into the face of the one that would take his life. And all of his victims would have been really happy to know he was scared. He screamed all the way down the hill. The beast took him to the bottom of the dark pool and broke quite a few bones in that evil bastard's body. He was just a limp bag of flesh when that Bigfoot surfaced with the lifeless Ogun. Dragging, then carrying the body, the still enraged Sasquatch set off for a place to bury the body so that it would never be found. Bigfoot seemed to have that knowledge naturally. Well, it took a few minutes for Liz to catch her breath. Quite an adrenaline rush she had. She watched as the beast ran off with her attacker and took him underwater. All so surreal. She had never seen an animal move that fast. And what of it? Twice in 1 year that she had an encounter with a Sasquatch? That's crazy. Most people have, 0 encounters in their lifetime. And why hadn't it injured her? I mean, it seemed like it wasn't even interested in her. Very strange and scary. Not just a cryptid encounter, but it had killed a man. What should I do, she wondered. What do I report? She gathered herself up and walked back to her truck. She was in a much better shape when she walked the mile back to the trailhead. Along the way, she'd made the decision to not make the report today. First of all, it was a fantastic story, and who would believe it? There was no body, and there was no blood. And on top of that, the beast had saved her from the crazy guy. So if she reported him, they would come and they would hunt him, and something about that didn't set well with Liz. There were no other vehicles in the parking lot as Liz drove her Park Service truck out onto the road and headed home. So, do you think Liz understood yet that this might be the same critter that had slobbered on her Subaru? She does seem a little slow on the uptake, huh? Maybe with a little time it'll come to her. That's sort of the way life is, friends. Some things that are a little obvious to some of us may not make any sense to others. And that's why it's important here to be a little tolerant, especially with so many crazy things going on in the world right now. Well, so old Liz is just working her way through the summer. Remember, her job is sort of a supervisory position where she travels her end of the district and inspects facilities and tourist sites. She's always looking for something that needs repair, and she'll write up a report, and then someone else goes to repair it eventually. She really cares about the forest, and she really cares about her job. She thinks it's important for the tourists to have a good experience, The forest belongs to all of us, and she's just working there so that we could enjoy it. And she realizes that. So she stays on top of things. Liz really goes the extra mile for the Forest Service. She's just a good employee to have. Well, the summer brings the tourists and the traffic, and the whole forest is alive with the plants and animals, and their busiest time of the year. With all that, we also have summer thunderstorms and wildfires. Wildfires are one of the most destructive things that can happen in these woods. So it was on a Tuesday evening in August, during an especially active thunderstorm with many lightning strikes. quite a few small fires were started because of those strikes. And because they're out towards the wilderness area within the park, there were no roads within a couple miles of the fires. So the fires would have to be fought, by hot shots. These are hand crews that are mobilized via helicopter or even sometimes they'll parachute in. These men and women are often the first ones on the fire line, and sometimes the only ones there. With help from airborne assets, like helicopters and fixed-wing airplanes, that drop retardant and they drop water. And, of course, the hand crews, and they build a line that the fire will not cross, and eventually it would die off. So at the very least, they're slowing the fire growth down in the early parts of the fire, which are important. And these men and women are really invaluable. Well, Liz could hear the chatter on the Forest Service radio in her pickup. It might be several hours and maybe not until tomorrow morning before the weather was such that the helicopters could fly the hotshots into the fire zone. Well, she knew the fires were several miles from most of the tourist facilities, but there were a few remote pit toilet buildings near the trailheads, parking lots and trailheads, at the end of her district. Now, she knew that it would be best to lower the steel fire curtains on those bathrooms. If nothing else, it'll keep the ashes and the embers out of the inside of the bathrooms. Even if the building burns down, you just can't do much about that. Well, just in case, it's best to lower those curtains. She also knew that if she wanted it done, that she'd have to do it herself. But by the time that she made a report and made its way through the normal channels, it could be 2 days. Besides, Wednesday and Thursday were normal days off, and she didn't want to go back to the office this afternoon. She'd just go out and lower the curtains herself, then she'd write a report when she got back on Friday. Piece of cake, right? Well, how many times have we said that, then things turn south? Well, she sat herself up for the real trouble because she didn't tell anyone where she was going. She pulled into the parking lot at the trailhead where the toilets were, then lowered the fire curtains into place with no problems. Then she thought, she'd walk out that trail about a quarter mile to a clear area, there were no trees in there, where she could look across the valley and see the mountain where the fires were. Kind of give her a better idea what's going on. Once again, without telling anyone where she was headed off to, she went. The view was fantastic from the clearing, and she could see a lot of the mountain from where she was, and if she were just to go down the slope a little bit, maybe 100 foot or so, she'd be able to see around the trees that were in the way where the trail was, cross through the clearing. So she worked her way down the slope, carefully, right? Because it was wet and it was mossy. It was on a hard rock face, and that's why there were no trees there. It was a rock outcropping, and it was where water was coming out, springing out, and so it was covered with moss and slick. Well, just as she reached out with her foot for a solid foothold, she's taking 1 foot at a time, 2 things happened at the same time. A grouse exploded seemingly out of the ground itself, just a few feet in front of her, and she lost her footing all at the same time. She smacked that rock face hard right behind the ear. She slipped and fell out, and she was instantly knocked out cold. She'd really got herself in a pickle this time. It seemed like forever to Liz. No memory of what had happened, sort of like starting over. She slowly became aware as she woke up, groggy and sore all over. She wasn't sure where she was. It seemed like she was on her back in a dark cave. She sure didn't know how she got there, and really didn't know where she was, so it was just, she tried to move, but everything hurt too much. She gave in to the pain, and everything went black. Out she went. It was about 5 hours later, about 10 in the morning, and she woke up again. She was confused, but she had a little more awareness. Everything hurt. Her head, her shoulder, her back, all where she had slipped and fell against that rock slope. Well, the morning light was filtering in the cave, and it made it no doubt that she was in a cave. She saw enough around her. She felt comfortable, too. Too comfortable for the rock and the dirt floor. Well, that's because she was laying on a carefully built bed of pine boughs, thickly covered with moss. She managed to sit up and she nearly passed out again. But she fought through it till things became clear and she was able to focus her eyes, looking around. She was in a room-sized cave, almost 20 foot square, and the opening was around a corner where the light came from. Now on a crudely split log laying right next to her was a gourd filled with clean water and a mat of moss covered with service berries and currants. Well, when she sat up, a primitive bandage fell from her head, and it was a mass of moss saturated with what looked like pulverized arnica flowers. So arnica, it's in the sunflower family, and it has healing powers. The poultice had helped her scalp to heal and kept the infection at bay. Now, who had brought her here and bandaged her head? Who had built the bed she lay on? Where was she? She was pretty confused, but aware that she must get to her truck and get to a doctor. Eating some berries and drinking deeply from the gourd was helping her to feel better. She felt strong enough to stand and try to walk. It took a while, but even with a splitting headache and a sore body, she made it to the cave mouth, and it appeared to be on the slope, similar to where she fell. It was fairly steep, and in fact, she was only about a mile upslope from where she went down. She didn't know that at the time, but she still didn't know where she was, but she stepped out onto the slope away from the cave mouth and looked around to get her bearings. As she was studying her surroundings, she saw what looked like a flower on the forest floor, about 50 feet away. It was a yellow flower with a yellow center, an arnica, like the poultice was made of. Well, she slowly walked to it, and as she got a few feet away, she saw that it had been placed there. It wasn't growing there. It had been pulled or cut, and it was laying on the floor, on the dirt. And looking beyond it is what appeared to be another one about 50 foot or so away in the same direction, down and to the left through the trees, sort of like at a 45-degree angle, downhill and then side hill, kind of midway. Well, she followed this same pattern of flowers placed in a line. It led her almost a mile down the mountain, slowly and taking great caution not to fall again, until she sighted what looked to be a building ahead through the trees. In fact, it was the bathroom where she started yesterday. All of a sudden, overcome with emotions, Liz began to shake and cry. She stopped for a couple minutes and just let herself go. She couldn't see to walk, so she stood where she was, and she just shook. Regaining her composure, she wiped her eyes and made the last couple 100 feet to her pickup truck. Because she'd told no one of her intentions when she left work yesterday, and it being her day off, she wasn't missed. The fire on this edge of the park had kept visitors from coming this way to use the trailhead. And the service had also, in fact, thrown up barricades in the road at the bottom of the hill about 2.5 miles back down the road to discourage tourists from coming up this way. So no one had seen the Forest Service truck in the parking lot and made an inquiry on why I was there. Liz had sort of kidnapped herself. Well, she got the truck going and made it by the barricades and into town to the Medi-Center. And they were able to get her right in, and it was determined she had a concussion. It took 10 stitches to close the wound, and they took an x-ray to look for clotting, which there was none. So they recommended bed rest and sent her away with a couple of prescriptions. She went home, and she decided she'd wait till tomorrow to call her boss and try to explain everything. Hell, she needed that time to try to figure out what really happened anyway. She remembered the fall, then waking up in the cave, and following the trail of arnicas back to the parking lot. She remembered how overwhelming it was to see something so familiar and safe as her truck. She remembered seeing the fire shutters down on the toilets and the sign for the loop trail in the parking lot. What she hadn't seen was the tall, hairy beast standing just back in the tree line as she drove slowly out of the lot. In fact, she'd been so intent with following the trail of yellow flowers that she hadn't seen him follow her from the cave to the trailhead. Now Liz was lucky. Someone or something was there to help her when she fell, and she'd got herself into a corner by not telling anyone where she was headed. Not smart, folks. Well, do you think she has any idea what it was that rescued her and possibly saved her life? Again. Do you think she'll remember? Poor Liz. Seems like she's got to figure this out eventually. One thing's for sure, where possible, have a contingency plan. You'd have too many people that'd miss you. Well, old Liz, she's been thinking about some things. A lot. And it's about time. She had one of those midnight epiphanies. Now, you ever have one of those? It happens to me. It starts as a dream where the characters, they're players in my life, and they're dealing with problems in my life in the dream, and when somehow their actions, they just clear as a log jam. Like everything becomes clear. And I usually wake up with a feeling of accomplishment. And it takes a while to get back to sleep. And then when I wake up in the morning, I'm tired, but less stressed. And that is what happened to old Liz. She's been trying to put together the thoughts of the last year. She thought that her first encounter with Bigfoot was the trail cam pictures of a large, youngish male obscenely licking and kissing her parked Subaru. Do you remember that? Well, did that creature leave the flowers on the car? Was he responsible for the rabbit? Then months later, when she was rescued from the attacker on the river overlook trail, was that the same creature that hauled that crazy man down the hill and disappeared into the river? Could it be the same one? Well, did she have a protector? And what were his intentions? Is this who or what had carried her to the cave and treated her wounds when she fell and knocked herself out? And then why? So many questions she had. Weren't Sasquatch killers? Certainly she'd seen one kill a man. But she never felt threatened. In fact, she really felt safe around this beast. Now certainly this creature, if it were just one creature, must have been around her pretty often to have saved her twice. Was it always there? And was it following her? Extremely curious now, Liz was determined to find out more about this beast behind these encounters. So as she had her granola and fruit breakfast that morning before work, she decided that since she was a scientist, she'd approach this a scientific way. She'd look for evidence, gather it, and then with an open mind, and she would make a decision on what was going on with this thing. She'd need to read up a bit on the subject, and to get her own data, she'd have to set up some trail cameras, which she'd used before. Well, remember when she got the 119 images of the creature caressing her car? Well, she knew of at least the 3 different places where she herself had contact with this beast. Or at least she thought so. Well, she'd start there, those places. That made sense. Now, with the confidence of a person with a plan, she cleaned up the kitchen and she readied herself for work. And before she left the house, she brought out her 2 trail cameras. She checked the memory chips and the battery life, and she determined to figure out and settle her curiosity once and for all. She drove the long way to the office. It wasn't unusual because she spent much of her time in the field anyway. So the park ranger stopped at several different facilities and tourist attractions as the morning progressed. That's her normal job is to inspect for needed repairs. You know, she was good at her job and she enjoyed being outdoors. She didn't miss much either. She found several areas that needed attention from the trail crews and some carpentry work where some tourist vehicle had pushed over a couple of fence posts on the edge of a parking lot. Not much more than that this morning. The tourists hadn't been too wild lately. Things had kind of slowed down. See, the summer was coming to an end. The days were getting a little shorter, just noticeably, and the kids were back in school. And that, in conjunction with that, and the colder nights, this was the best time to enjoy the woods. And Liz was certainly enjoying herself while she was making the rounds. When eventually she found herself in the parking lot, near the pit toilets at the trailhead, where she had slipped and fell a few weeks back. Do you remember that? Well, it was quite a dramatic effect when when she awoke in a cave a mile from the parking lot with her head wound was bandaged and treated with poultice. And she had no memory of how she got there in that cave. Well, she parked her Forest Service pickup and found herself staring at the bathroom buildings. The maintenance staff had raised the fire curtains since she had last been there. And not sure where her newfound courage came from, she decided to hike up the mountain to the outcrop at the ridge top and ultimately to the cave where she found herself when she regained consciousness several weeks back. So she got her backpack out and she put on her duty belt where she carried a Forest Service radio, a flashlight, and some pretty strong bear spray. And in her pack, she carried water and trail food and a thermal shelter and one of her game cameras. She locked the truck and set out. This time, however, having learned from the past, she left a note on the dash describing her direction of travel. Good thinking, Liz. She set out past the toilets and she started up the hill. Navigating from memory, she climbed through the tall trees for, about 45 minutes. She stopped frequently to catch her breath and just look around and enjoy the forest. There was lots of birds flying around today, and she saw more than a few squirrels and chipmunks. They were working hard to gather up for a winter store. She wasn't following a trail. Where she walked was just pine needles and fallen limbs. The forest was pretty open underneath the canopy of these large trees. She knew she would eventually come to the rocky ridge top, and from there she would travel up and down the ridge until she found that rocky outcrop where the cave was. Now, Liz wasn't sure what she'd find there, but she knew that she just had to see it to satisfy her curious mind. That was like a check-the-box kind of a thing for her at that point. Well, the ranger hit the ridge after about another 30 minutes of walking, then spent about 20 minutes going up and down until she found the cave entrance. It was in a large outcropping of big bouldery rocks. Well, she cautiously approached the opening. She had her flashlight in one hand and she had her bear spray in the other. She didn't really need either one. The cave was shallow and it was empty. Kind of a disappointment. Not really the way she had remembered it. But then again, she was with a head injury and in a concussive state. I've been there, folks. You kind of do things in a dreamlike state. Has that ever happened to you? Well, Liz was a little disappointed that she hadn't found more answers here in this cave. There was no evidence of her ever being there. No bed of pine boughs, no gourd of water, no nuts and berries, and no sign of any yellow flowers. Oh, she was sure it happened, and Liz was definitely sure that it was here in this cave where she had been carried and put in a bed to heal, but who or what was still a mystery. Okay, now I'm going to set a camera, but I don't think that this is the place to do it. See, there's no sign of any use of this cave. That's what she was thinking. No, it seems that the only time I've been visited by Bigfoot is when I was in need, except for when I got the first pictures from the trail camera in my Subaru. So, if I can't catch him by surprise, then I'll let him come to me. Now, sometimes the craziest ideas make sense to us because of the crazy circumstances we find ourselves in. And so it was that our Liz, the heroine of our story, the level-headed park ranger that she was, came up with a plan. She would use herself as bait. Liz would set up camp and hope to be visited by the creature. Now, I told you it was crazy. She was that curious. She really wanted to be sure, one way or another, whether there was a Bigfoot that was following her, and what exactly were his intentions. Now, the creature had ample opportunity to hurt her if he'd wished to, and was capable of harm to a human. Well, she witnessed that firsthand. Liz really believed that she wasn't in danger from the beast that she had encountered several times before. So her plan was simple. She would camp out alone and spend time walking in the woods. That way, she would have the most exposure to the beast. And the best location in Liz's mind was a remote spot that was rarely visited by tourists. In fact, most people didn't know about it. It was sort of a park ranger secret spot. Well, she would get dropped off and backpack for 2 days into this beautiful location that had a small lake with a clean, cold creek fed into it. She'd camped there before, and And because it was off the main trail system, it was just rarely visited. It had everything with fresh water from the creek, and it had trout from the lake, and wild onions, and miner's lettuce in the meadow near the big sandy beach where she'd set up camp. Now Liz arranged for 5 days off, which she had coming, and that gives her 9 days total if you figure the weekends on either end of that. And she talked a girlfriend into giving her a ride to drop her off at Trailhead. And she just told the girlfriend, who had a lot of questions, she said she just needed some time alone. Yeah, it worked out. She set off and she had a good couple days hike into the lake. It was beautiful, just as she expected, and Liz was already glad she'd come, regardless of what might happen. It was a great campsite and the fishing was good. The trout would rise to the surface and they'd take just about any fly that she would present them. Kind of paradise, folks. It was the second afternoon she'd been in her camp at the lake. Liz had been on a nice day hike and had covered close to 5 miles. She'd circled the lake and she'd walked the creek to its source. It was a spring in the rocks where it just poured out. Oh, it was just beautiful, and the water so cold and clear. Gosh, if you've ever found one of those springs, and most of you have, gosh, drink some of that water, fill your jug, whatever you got with you, your canteen, and that's always the best water, good mineral water. Well, she also, along the way, she'd harvested some edible greens for dinner. She was tired and dirty from the hike, and she decided a good dip in the lake is what she needed. Well, she was alone at the lake, and in fact, she hadn't seen anybody since she'd been dropped off 4 days before. Like I said, paradise. She stripped down and she washed out her clothes with the lake water and hanging them over bushes to dry in the afternoon sun. She then waded out in the cold lake water and began to scrub clean the dust and the dirt from her body. She'd always used biodegradable cleansers so as not to pollute. And so it really worked out pretty good for her. Oh, she had such a good time. She frolicked around in that lake for 20 minutes. Though cold, it felt so good on her tired body that she just didn't want to get out. Then at some point the cold finally got her and she decided to get out. It was then while swimming toward camp, but she got a shock that stopped her right where she was. There, standing on the beach, with the shirt she had set out to dry in its hand, was the most magnificent creature she'd ever seen. 8 foot tall and 3.5 foot wide, covered mostly in long, reddish-brown hair. It stood facing her, and what she felt was sort of a non-threatening stance. Motionless and without any sound, he just stood there and stared at her as she treaded water. They both kept this up for a good, 5 minutes. Liz, being cold, finally decided to act. She slowly swam towards the beach, straight towards the beast. He didn't move. He just stood holding her shirt in his huge hand. And when she was about 30 foot from shore, her feet struck bottom. With her eyes locked on the intruder's eyes, she slowly took steps toward him. She stopped only about 15 feet between them. She stood, fully exposed in dripping water from the lake. They stayed eyes locked facing each other for a full 10 count. Then the beast's eyes took her in head to toe, and he slowly turned and walked back into the dark woods where he'd come from. As he was turning, Liz thought she saw, no, she was sure she saw, a slight smile begin to form on his face. Liz, for her part, released a huge breath and closed her eyes. Now sure that her Bigfoot meant her no harm, she walked forward to finish drying and get herself dressed. While dressing, she realized that he still had her shirt in his hand when he turned to leave. Damn, she thought, one of my favorites, a long-sleeved concert shirt she'd bought at a reggae fest. Well, she'd just have to forget about that. It was gone. So she busied herself getting dinner prepped, and she caught 3 nice trout and cooked them over the fire on a stick through the gills. Served with greens that she had gathered, it was a great meal. As she sat by the campfire with her mug of tea, she reflected on the trip so far. Not sure what it all meant, but convinced that he meant her no harm. In fact, this beast may have saved her life more than once. These thoughts were still in her head when she fell asleep that night. Knowing what she knew now, what would she do next? What would you do? I know that's a lot to figure, so let's just call it a night for Liz. I'm glad you were all here this evening. We're all better for the company. Be someone's friend. They might need you. I want to let you know what Liz has been up to. She stayed one more night at her campsite at the lake. She didn't see any signs of the beast after their first contact, but she felt a certain presence in the air as if he were still nearby. It didn't make her nervous anymore. She's pretty much convinced that Bigfoot, at least this one, meant her no harm. He seemed to be a protector of sorts. Wouldn't that be something? Who wouldn't want an 8-foot bodyguard? Even with all she had learned recently, Liz had lots of questions. We weren't taught to believe that this Bigfoot creature wasn't anything but dangerous to humans. There are just too many stories of interactions between the beasts and people that didn't turn out good for the people. Sasquatch and the other variants just seemed to be angry and violent all the time. But that wasn't this ranger's experience. She'd been rescued twice by this beast who had several chances to do her harm if that was what he wanted to do. So with an air of curiosity and interest, our ranger began her hike out to the trailhead. It had taken 2 days to get her into the campsite by the lake, and it would take her 2 days walking to get out. The first day's hike went well, and she stopped for night at the well-used campsite beside a small creek. It was only about 6 miles from the trailhead, in the parking lot where she had arranged to be picked up by her girlfriend. After dinner, she sat down by the campfire with her back against the log and with her mug of tea, and she thought about things long enough to decide that she would do what it took to figure this out. She realized that she was in a unique situation. And to learn about the Sasquatch with first-hand information, it would be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and for whatever reason it was offered to her. Well, she decided she would accept it. She slept well that night and had a good walk out. Her friend met her in the parking lot as arranged, and as they loaded her backpack into the back of the car, she asked about the week-long trip. Curious how it went for Liz. Now, the ranger just told her friend that it was a good time and a good hike and much-needed vacation. She wasn't really ready to share just yet. Most people wouldn't really understand the relationship with the beast. Liz decided she would keep this part of her life private. Excited to see what might happen next, she prepared herself to return to work. And for the next 2 weeks, Liz was so busy at work that she didn't give much thought to her big friend. She had season-end reports to write and was busy with all the last-minute preparations for the fall hunting season, which required facility inspections and trail maintenance and all that stuff. So it was in the middle of October when the hunters were in the woods, and just after the first snowstorm had come and gone, that the ranger ran into the beast again. Liz was following up on a problem bear report. That is, some hunters had a bear tear up their campsite while they were all out hunting. The bear made a mess of things, breaking into 2 trucks and a camper, besides eating their food supplies. The worst of it was that a pet dog belonging to one of the group had been killed and half eaten by the Bruin. The hunters said it was big, judging by the tracks it left and the damage it had committed. The ranger was used to this type of service call, and as there was a fair amount of human-wildlife conflicts in her district. Normally the problem bear was to be observed if possible, pictures taken to identify it. Then, if deemed a threat, it would be relocated if possible. Really only a small percentage of these bears are destroyed. Well, where this event took place was a particularly brushy drainage. The campsite was at the extreme end of a dirt road near a small creek that ran through the drainage bottom. As Ranger Liz drove into the campsite, evidence of the raid on the camp was still evident, though the hunters had been working on cleaning up the carnage. There was glass from a broken window on the Ford F-250, while the Dodge Ram had the door itself twisted away from the door frame. camper showed the most damage, however, where the bear had decided to tear in through the wall itself, shredding aluminum siding and 2x2s to get into the barking dog. It was a sobering scene where it was obvious the dog had been killed and carried to the center of camp near the still smoking fire ring and partially eaten. The dog's owner had wrapped his pet in a blanket and had put his remains in a large Yeti cooler. He wanted to take the body home and have it cremated. The ranger gave her condolences and began her investigation. She was able to get a few hair samples from the Dodge pickup and took quite a few photos of the damage. The ferocity of the attack seemed unusual, and most significantly, the footprints in the dirt around camp were huge, though it was thought in this area that only black bears could be found. The last grizzly was killed 80 years or so back. Though not impossible, certainly unheard of. There are ways to tell the difference between black bears and grizzlies by their tracks. The claws are longer and the front foot is more square on a grizzly. That and the size had the hairs standing up on this ranger's neck. For all of the signs pointed to this being a fairly large grizzly bear. The hair sample would confirm the ranger's observations. Well, the hunters were now breaking camp and they were going to head home. They had their spirits broken. Liz decided she would close their campsite and barricade the dirt road where it left the main road until they could find this destructive Bruin. They told Ranger Liz that they would be caravanning out in about an hour. With this information, Liz decided to do a little scouting around and see if she could determine what direction the bear had come from and, more importantly, which direction it had gone. All that the Park Service issued this ranger for protection against wildlife was her bear spray. It was good stuff, however, 2.5% capsicum. She carried it on her belt with her flashlight and a folding buck knife. Definitely underarm for grizzly, but then this bear had probably ran off when the hunters returned to camp and was likely scared of humans. Since this remote campsite was down in the brushy drainage, her service radio was out of contact with the office or any of the other personnel. And since she would be heading back within the hour, she reasoned she would just do a short circle around camp. Now, do we see Ranger Liz setting herself up again? Man, oh man, I bet she wishes she could have that one back. As the camp was being hastily packed away, our hero began her exploration of the surrounding creek bottomland. Thick willows by the creek itself and heavy alders on the slopes made for slow going. Circling camp slowly, Liz was able to identify several game trails, none of which was the obvious ingress or egress of the monster Bruin. Tracks were going to be hard to identify as there was just little bare dirt. Instead, the ranger was looking for broken branches and smashed brush where a heavy animal had passed through. Well, after about the second full circle of camp, she was almost 100 yards out and she was still circling. The bear, meanwhile, had been listening the whole time to her movements in the brush. Though he hadn't planned his location as a retreat to ambush, he had simply moved out to await the hunters to leave again when he could return to his easy meal. It wasn't easy finding so much to eat when you're an old bear. He had been the prime breeder for most of his 22 years on the planet. But being pushed out by younger, stronger males, he had wandered to where he was now. There was no resistance to his claim of dominance now. Most meals were easy meals. He just claimed the kill from smaller, weaker animals. However, the vanquished king was used to taking what he wanted, and he would not give ground to one person on foot. He would defend his position to the death. A mile away on the ridgetop above the drainage, the Sasquatch walked into the stream of scent from below. A comfortable feeling from a familiar smell came over the young, big-footed beast. He took another good whiff, then something. His comfort was gone. The unfamiliar smell of an animal. The urine smell and the smell of a scavenger assaulted his senses. His feeling of comfort was gone. In its place, he had gone through curiosity and panic. Those two smells, the patchouli and the scavenger, shouldn't both be so prominent. Now he was in anger mode. His friend, the ranger Liz, whom he considered the only non-threatening human he had ever encountered, was in close proximity to a large predator. He instantly started over the ridge and down the hill, working into the wind. He gathered speed, keeping the strongest scent stream in his face. Unknown to Ranger Liz, she was working her way toward a very dangerous encounter. The bear lay almost hidden in the alder brush just 50 yards away. All of his senses were being focused on the human crossing his back trail, and he was sure from the sounds and the smells that she was small and female. He was becoming emboldened with the thought of a fresh kill. Like so many in his life, he would gorge, then cover her up to hide her carcass from the birds and lay down nearby to sleep, then rise and gorge again. That was his plan. She was now within a few yards and unaware of the danger that was so near. The predator was readying himself for a charge and an attack. Being so focused on Liz, he wasn't aware of the distant crashing of branches and the rapid footfall of the beast moving down the slope towards him. Now Liz was stopped. She had come to what she believed was the trail of a large bear. She was stooped over and studying the ground for a clear track when it happened. The old crusty predator exploded out of his hide where he lay. With a guttural growl, he lunged up and out just 30 feet from where the ranger stood frozen in place. He was sure that he could be on his prey and kill it within a few seconds. What he hadn't figured in was the huge reddish-brown blur moving in from his right side and slightly behind him. The old king had never been taken by surprise. But then, he had never, in his almost quarter of a century on this planet, met a Bigfoot, and never one that was this angry. I would like to say that it was over immediately, but it wasn't. It was one hell of a fight. The bear fighting as they do, with swatting claws and biting and slashing with their teeth, and the Sasquatch with his amazing strength and opposing thumbs was grabbing and pulling the bear to pommel him with his fists and bite deeply into flesh and bone. At one time, the hairy hominid swung a large limb that lay nearby, breaking it over the bear's head, severing an ear and closing an eye. The fight went on for almost 10 minutes. When the attack began, Liz immediately ran back towards her pickup truck, just in time to see the dust in the air from the last of the hunters' caravan as they left the campsite. She hovered near her open door, unable to do anything but listen to the roars from the combatants and see an occasional swaying bush top or a flash of brown and red color through the brush. With adrenaline pumping strong through her veins, Liz listened intently to the battle. With a last loud roar, the fight was over. The only sound now was the creek babbling on the rocky bottom. Nearly 15 minutes had passed when Liz, emboldened by her curiosity and armed with the square point shovel from the bed of her truck, made her way back towards the bear trail and the last sounds of the battle. Moving slowly, on full alert, the sound of her heart beating in her ears, she progressed forward, stopping to look and listen every 2 or 3 steps. Then she saw it. In the brush nearby, concealed by the greenery, was just a little patch of fur. Summoning all the courage she had, she moved towards it. When she was within about 10 feet of what she had seen, she recognized it as a bear, or the remains of an obviously deceased bear. A huge dead bear. Dead in a way that it was disemboweled. And looking closely, she could see that its skull was misshapen and crushed. A foreleg was bent back onto itself. This monarch had met his better. Convinced the giant bear was no more a threat, Liz looked off to her left and heard a little moan, barely audible. She started cautiously towards the sound, not sure what she'd find. Not sure what it was that had hit the grizzly bear and stopped his charge on Liz. She was so intent on getting away and back to her truck that she didn't see much, just kind of a brownish-red blur. Well, her discovery was much the same as with the bear. First a patch of color through the brush, then the closer she got, she saw a form in the crushed alders. Laying in a nearly fetal position was a large, bloody beast. Obviously injured from the fight, his eyes were closed, and little moans came from deep within his chest. Now Liz was more sure of one thing than ever in her life. If there was any way to save this Sasquatch, then she would do it. She owed him that. Now, this Bigfoot had been injured severely in the fight with that huge old grizzly bear. When that bear ambushed Ranger Liz, her large protector ambushed the Bruin. The battle killed the grizzly bear and damn near killed the beast. And Forest Ranger Liz was not a doctor, but she'd had enough first aid training to recognize that besides the bleeding from all over the prone figure, there could easily be internal injuries as well. It was pretty well known that the swatting pressure from the paws of a mad bear could break bones, and often did. Now, Liz wasn't sure how she was going to approach this. This was a wild Bigfoot creature, and being injured, it might be difficult and dangerous to approach. You know, we all go into a self-defense mode when we're hurt, right? So knowing that we all need water to drink and thinking that he might be immobilized, she ran to her truck and she brought out the 3 water bottles that she found in the cab. Well, she cautiously approached that large, hairy creature. It was frightening to be this close to such an awesome animal. Liz unscrewed the lid off the bottle and reaching out with a shaky hand, she poured just a small trickle of water on the lips of the monster. First, no response. Liz wondered if he had died. Well, glancing toward his chest, she saw a barely perceptible rise and fall motion. So the badly injured animal then he licked his lips, and Park Ranger drizzled more water onto his mouth. And he managed to drink several mouthfuls. So Liz just set the water bottles down, just kind of within his reach, and began an assessment of his injuries. Well, the Bigfoot had blood everywhere on his upper torso, and his fur was matted with branches and leaf litters all tangled up in it. Now, the good thing was that even though he was seeping lots of blood, there didn't appear to be any arterial bleeding. And since she couldn't move him by herself and she wasn't going to bring anyone else in to help, she decided she'd have to care for him right where he lay. Now, this ranger knew that her chance of helping this Bigfoot would be best in the first few hours. And she would have to go and find some medications, and the sooner the better. Now, there wasn't much she could do for her patient without him. So, taking a final look at that large, bloody form of the beast, she turned to leave. By the time she got to her truck, she was shaking like a leaf. The adrenaline was leaving her body slowly. Pretty exciting deal. And as she drove out, she thought of all the violence that had taken place in this creek bottom in the last 24 hours, and she shuddered. Nature sure could change in a split second. As she drove out of that rough, dusty road, she was deep in thought. You know, she did her best thinking behind the wheel. A lot of us do. Well, I do. So she thought it's best to leave the barricades at the head of this road where it intersected with the large, more traveled Forest Service road, and she would hold off on making her report for as long as she could. Liz, she didn't ordinarily turn in a non-actionable report until the end of the week anyway, and by then she'd hope to have this situation solved, well, one way or another. Her idea was to go down to the riding stables, just down by the visitor center off the paved road. Only about a 30-minute drive once she got out of this creek drainage. And she felt like she was in a hurry. And in fact, she was driving a little fast. But fortunately, there was hardly any traffic this time of year. Only hunters and a few die-hard berry pickers. Pulling into the parking lot at the stables in a cloud of dust, Liz the Ranger, the forest ranger with a unique friend in need, shut down the truck and sat and took a deep breath. See, she wanted to be calm. She didn't want to give away her secret mission. So settled, she opened the door and she stepped out. Liz was lucky that day, for the first person she ran into was Lucille Van Durst. She was a fiery, tough, lean, and a little rough around the edges wrangler, and a cowgirl all her life, very knowledgeable about the workings of cattle and horses. That's the way country folk are. Lucille looked up as Liz approached. "Howdy," she said. You see, that's the universal greeting of wranglers and outdoors men and women everywhere. "Hello," said Liz. "How are you today?" "Good and ready," says the wiry cowgirl. "We've packed in 3 base camps this week already, and we'll be at it for the next several days. How are you, ma'am, and what can I do you for, Ranger?" "Well," says Liz, I want to ask a favor of you. You see, I have found a sick animal, and I want to try to help it to recover." The wrangler turned from the pack animal she was rigging, and her eyebrows just barely arched, and said, "Mostly these wild animals won't make it out here with any injuries. What with the predators and all. Sort of nature's way." "I know that," says Liz. "This is a bit of a unique situation, and thought I might be able to make a difference." After a slight pause, and seeing that was all the ranger was going to offer for information, the wrangler turned and walked toward the open door of the tack room. Looking over her shoulder, she motioned for the ranger to follow her. As they got into the cool, shady tack room, the cowgirl turned to her and said, "I can see that this might be a sensitive subject, but because I do care for animals more than people sometimes, what can I do to help? How is this elk or deer or bear hurt?" Liz, for her part, didn't take the bait. She did say that this is a huge animal, and he's all cut up and sore. He fell down a cliff and might not make it anyway. The wrangler then said, "Well, you're gonna need some bute for the pain. But this bute sometimes loops them out. It kind of depends on the animal. And you're going to need some penicillin for the infection. And I'd recommend some betadine topical ointment to treat any scrapes and wounds. It's antibacterial." She then asked Liz if she needed to stitch any cuts or wounds, and Liz told her she didn't think so, but she didn't know. She said the patient was immobile. Well, the wrangler reached into the doctoring cabinet and withdrew large syringes of the bute and penicillin, and grabbed a spray bottle of the betadine. Handing them to Liz, she explained the dosages. No more than 2 grams a day of bute for a 1,000-pound horse, and 1 milliliter per hundredweight of penicillin. See, the betadine you use externally as much as you want. Well, the park ranger was relieved to get the meds, and taking them from the wrangler, she asked her, "How much do I owe you?" I will pay you cash. I don't want this to go on the books." Looking her in the eye, that steely cowgirl said, "Well, it's on the house. I might need a favor sometime for one of my projects off the books." The ranger stood up straight and, turning to go, said to the wrangler, "Thank you. I owe you one." As she started the truck to leave, she saw that the packer had returned to work on the pack saddle, as if nothing had really happened here. Perfect, thought Liz. Now I gotta get back if there's any chance of helping this beast. Driving through the barricades and moving them back into place across the road, Liz could see that no one had drove in or out since she did an hour ago. She could tell that by the tracks on the dirt road. Now, relieved of this, since she really didn't want anybody to know just what she was trying to do down in that creek bottom, the ranger parked her truck by the fire ring and she exited slowly. She stood and listened carefully before she moved across the creek toward the area where the big hairy beast had conquered the grizzly bear in battle. As she approached cautiously, she became alarmed that she couldn't see the reddish-brown fur of that Bigfoot where he lay when she left almost 2 hours ago. She could see where he had drug himself some 20 foot farther up into the alders. He lay on his back in a depression of sorts amongst the roots and the limbs of the bushes. Very much a defensible position he was in. Well, Liz crouched over the place where she last seen him and noticed that though there was lots of staining from the blood, there wasn't the pink blobs or large chunks associated with lung or arterial bleeding. Now, she didn't want to surprise the beast, so she thought she'd hum. This morning, leaving the office in her Forest Service pickup, the radio played a Beatles song before she lost reception. And you know how a song sticks in your head? Well, such it was with "I Wanna Hold Your Hand." You know that song, everybody does. She slowly approached the creature, crouching and humming. No movement from the beast, but she noticed the water bottles had been bitten through and lay empty where he once was. She sat on her heels and watched the patient closely. His eyes were closed, and his breathing was shallow. She was only a few feet away with a tree trunk laying between them. Her heart was beating wildly as she reached out, holding the syringe full of painkiller. She was now humming the song as loud as she could, as she plunged that needle into his massive thigh. Well, just a slight flinch, nothing more. Emboldened with that, she gave him the penicillin shot a few inches away in the upper thigh. This was going so well that she decided to go back to her truck and bring the bentonine to spray on his wounds. Humming loudly, she returned to his side with the bottle of antiseptic and began to spray his body. With the bottle empty, she set it aside and looked at the hairy face. She moved just a bit closer to confirm the strangest occurrence, that it sounded like he was humming along with her. Not accurately, but a guttural sort of purring sound. Wow, thought Liz. That butte really works. Lucille was right. Well, so she left her ice chest full of water from the creek, as close as she could drag it to his resting spot. She now was willing to leave to go home to gather her thoughts and some food together. She planned to return early in the morning before heading into the office. Maybe with a little food, the beast would heal enough to move under his own power. The ranger wasn't sure how long she could keep this spur road closed before someone, probably a hunter, would drive around the barricades and come on down to the campsite, and then who knows what would happen. So still humming her song, she backtracked to her pickup truck and drove out around the barricades and home. And once home, she was going through her freezer trying to find something to feed the convalescent Bigfoot. Surely some meat, right? Well, all she found was a leg of lamb that someone had given her last year. She brought it out to thaw. That and some yogurt was all she had at home that would possibly work. She didn't want to drive to town to the market. She was exhausted and she was going to get up early, so she had some hummus and chips and she took herself to bed. Strange dreams came and went all night, in which the beast was discovered by hunters and shot dead, or that the beast killed the hunters, and then he would be tracked and hunted. Not very rested, but 2 cups of coffee awake, Liz left home, anxious to get back to the battle scene, so that she would know that her big hairy patient had made it through the night. She was soon to find out that she shouldn't have worried about that 8-foot, almost 500-pound killing machine. She saw the first wolf carcass from the creek as she was crossing, broken and bled out, and its death was obvious from a distance. The second wolf was torn apart and partially eaten. The beast, for his part, had backed himself into the brush in a defensive position and was startled awake by Liz's approach. His eyes were clear, but he grimaced as he stood and began to walk through the brush and slowly back up the slope from where he had come just yesterday. With a last look over his shoulder at Liz, he disappeared into the brush and timber. Stunned to see the giant moving and alive, Liz watched him out of sight, then turned to survey the scene of so much violence over the last couple days, shocked to see that the grizzly bear had been buried deeply in soil and brush and maybe never to be found. The rangers set about to clean the creek bottom of any evidence. She picked up her water bottles and returned the ice chest to the bed of her truck. Liz then drug what was left of the two wolves and buried them as deep as she could on the hillside right above the creek bed. Satisfied, she moved back to her truck and headed back up the hill. She planned on leaving this spur road closed for as long as she could, maybe another couple weeks, when the coming rains would wash away all evidence of what had happened here. And as she passed through the barricades, Liz wondered if she would ever see her friend again. Regardless, she thought they were even. Well, there you go. Liz had quite an adventure. Now, for a park ranger, she sure has an exciting life. I don't think that's normal for most rangers. Well, Liz did see that Bigfoot again, but it was some time later, and I can't wait to tell you that story. Well, here we all are again, circled around this campfire, and a nice big one it is tonight. With this full moon in the sky, it's sort of spooky, which is appropriate for the season. Now, many of you took the little ones around to the neighbors for candy and treats. Some of you adults dress up in outlandish outfits to celebrate the end of summer and the Halloween holiday. There are some great costumes out there. Hard to tell the real from the made up. What are you to do when you see a Bigfoot and a dog man standing side by side in conversation? If it weren't for the red solo cups in their hands, you might want to run. And that's what brings us to tonight's story. Sort of an update on Ranger Liz, our favorite forest ranger that just recently had another encounter with that 8-foot beast, where she helped him to recover from the battle wounds incurred with that big old grizzly bear, and intended to make a meal out of Liz. It didn't work out too well for the bear. He's now buried where he died. The enigmatic Sasquatch with a bruised and battered body walked away, as they do, to heal. Now, that was several weeks ago, and the ranger didn't know if she would ever see that animal again. She busied herself with the everyday chores and responsibilities of her job. There was always something to do. The facilities maintenance was an ongoing thing. This year, as always, Liz was to train the new hires in her division. And she was responsible in showing the 3 new ranger trainees all the roads, all the facilities in their district. While it wasn't too complicated, it encompassed a fairly large area. So while spending so much time together, she became familiar with the new hires. There was Darius from just south of Atlanta, and Cody, he was from Twin Falls, Idaho, and Megan, that hailed from Manhattan, New York of all places. All 3 of them were selected from hundreds of applications for the job. They shared a zeal for the out-of-doors. Cody was the only one with any real out-of-doors experience. They all 3 were eager to fit in, and they were learning. They were learning the Forest Service way of doing things. It made Liz's job easy that they were willing to accept instruction so readily. The 3 new rangers had started their careers on the 1st of October and were just getting comfortable with the swing of things. They had met most of the people in and around the Forest Service region. There were the 3 rangers, of course, and then the office staff, which were a few, then the stores and the restaurants, and the 2 service stations and the corrals and the pack station. There was also a small hotel, and then there was the snow machine and the ATV rental outfit. In the summer, there might be almost 100 people working in that area. Well, now that the season had changed, everyone had cut back to winter staff, and a few services were pulling out till springtime. So every year, the Halloween party was the goodbye to summer and its workers. It was the biggest event of the year. Always the chance to whoop it up and say goodbye to friends. You know, like most of these events, there's always a few that overdo it. They're young and they don't know their limit, or they just overdo it. It's always a good time. It seems that because everyone's in costume, there is no hierarchy. There is no boss and there is no bottom of the totem pole. You're equal for one night. It always starts around dark. They push everyone out and lock the dance hall at around midnight. There's a barbecue grill going with donated meats and veggies, and many people bring side dishes. It's sort of a big picnic. Because officially there is no drinking in the dance hall, all that kind of fun, that takes place in the parking lots and amongst the trees surrounding the hall. And man, oh man, is there some drinking going on. Many a reveler has had their first drink at the annual Halloween bash. And it wasn't unusual to see a staggering partier or a costumed attendee hanging over the bushes vomiting from too much drink. It was a heck of a party every year, and this year was no different. There were almost 400 people at this year's blowout. All the Forest Service staff were there. Many of them brought their spouses or a good friend, and all the packers and wranglers were present as well. But heck, I haven't met a cowboy yet that would miss a party. Well, there were people everywhere. The band played loudly and the liquor flowed, even if it was out in the parking lot. It was just a hoot. Well, the band played, people danced and ate. There was a lot of laughing, a fair amount of drinking, shoot, just like I told you. The gathering also attracted some undesirables. And so it was that making their way through the crowd and watching for any opportunity to steal were the Jensen brothers and their friend Squid. They were pretty good at being bad. None of them played by the rules we do. They figured if they could take it from you, then you didn't want it bad enough. 3 of the worst, most low-down humans you'd ever meet. And they'd been perfecting their craft their whole lives. Moving through the crowd, they'd steal a drink, or they'd steal dinner tickets. They'd find somebody's coat that was unattended, and they'd just kind of rifle through the pockets. When the 3 of them had gotten their fill of that fine barbecue and that bottle of Jim Beam that Squid had removed from someone's jacket pocket, they started to work their way out to the parking lot. For this was where the richest hunting ground was for a thief. There were ice chests with beer in the back of the trucks. There were tools. There was always a chance of a purse or a wallet with cash and cards, and always the random pistol or rifle behind a seat. Yeah, it was all for their taking. If stupid, trusting people left it and walked away, they must not care about it. They learned some of their best techniques in jail and prison, where all the best criminal minds gathered to share their craft secrets. Oh, it was a good year. Lots of cars and trucks to pick from, and with 3 of them working together, keeping one as a lookout, they felt pretty comfortable as only a criminal mind can. They were making many trips to their rusty old Impala, and the trunk was filling up pretty fast. The 3 social degenerates were winding down, and they wanted to go back to the dance hall and see the costume contest. That was always the best part of the evening. There was always some creative genius that had some great idea for a costume, and more to the 3 criminals' interest, they're often a sexy and revealing costume that the ladies wore, even here in the cold mountain air. This is when the jackets and the coats came off and got laid across the chair backs. It was perfect time for Squid and the brothers, and they planned on scoring some more during that event. They were working their way through the cars and the trucks in the lot, back toward the dance hall. They were only about 150 foot from the building, when a large, dark shape stepped out from between 2 motorhomes and stopped directly in their path. Not sure what to do, Squid stopped short and two brothers almost ran into his back. Squid turned around and told the two degenerates, "Move out of my way," as he squeezed between them. His intention was to move over a row or two and head on to the dance hall. But as he rounded the back of a pickup truck and turned toward the party, there that dark shape was again. There were no lights out here in the parking lot, so Squid only saw the dark shape, somewhat backlit by the party lights. It looked huge. Squid thought it had to be a costumed reveler messing with him. So without fear, he made the worst decision in his miserable life. Oh, he'd made many bad decisions, but this was the worst. As the two brothers blindly followed him, they walked straight toward that large dark shadow. Squid thought that the drunk teen in the large ape suit would move out of the way when they got close. He was a bully, and with the two brothers' help, they could beat this kid up for messing with him. They'd ganged up on people before, mostly when they'd been caught breaking into someone's car. And with the three of them coming from three different directions, and not many could win a fight against that gang of criminals. When he got within about arm's distance, he knew something was wrong. This suit was too good, and this thing was huge. What did it for him, though, was the eyes. Even in this poor light, he could see that the eyes were alive and intelligent. And worst of all was the cold, hard malice in the expression on this creature's face. Yeah, he was sure now that their three lives were on the line. Certain that he couldn't outrun whatever this was, he pulled his folding knife and flipped it open. Before Squid could move to use his weapon, a large, meaty hand with long, hairy fingers grabbed and enveloped his hand, knife and all, crushing the bones into pieces of bones. When his hand was released from the grip, Squid fell straight down, passed out from the pain, without a squeak. The brothers turned to run, and before they could take 2 steps, their heads bounced together, making a loud cracking sound, sort of like a coconut sounds when it's thumped. The party went on without him. The nominations were being placed for the costume contest finals. See, partiers they'd fill out a card with their choice of the best costume, and when the cards were counted and tallied up, the 12 finalists are set. Then the finalists are rounded up and they parade around on stage for the loudest approval by applause. The winner gets $250. The second place was $100. The 3 criminals, however, never got to cast a vote. They were found trussed up tightly, their hands tied back to their feet, hog-tied, I believe. They were laid out on the ground and surrounded by the items they had stolen from the partygoers. Their Impala, strangely enough, never ran again. It wasn't worth fixing with all the damage it had incurred there in the lot. Nobody could figure out who had beat that car so badly, but then not much effort was spent trying to solve that mystery. Squid and the 2 brothers claimed it was an escaped lunatic in an ape-man costume that did that to him. But with the evidence of their crimes and their criminal records, nobody believed them, and they were convicted. All 3 went back to prison for a while. What sort of went unnoticed is there were 25 preliminary votes for a life-size Bigfoot to be placed in the final round of the costume contest. But that partier couldn't be found, so the $250 went to a couple in a horse costume. It's a shame because the people that saw it said that Bigfoot costume was very realistic. Well, that'll show you folks. Sometimes good does prevail over evil. Not often enough for me, but it feels good when it does. Now, I'm glad I could tell you this story, and I'm sure we'll come up with another. We always do. Well, did you remember all the adventures of old Forest Ranger Liz? It's kind of different when you can hear them all put together like that. She has definitely had an eventful year. Thing is, adventure seems to be attracted to this one, Forest Ranger, and I can't wait to tell you what she's got into now. But it's been a long night, the fire's burnt down, and I'm worn out. So let's get together again soon, and we'll share another fire and some stories, of course. Until then, hug your loved ones. This is Clay Steele. Good night.